of the Olympiad today, there was a very nice win by world champion Magnus Carlsen against Poland's top player, 2735 grandmaster named Wojtaszek. Can't really pronounce it correctly, but anyways, Carlsen played a pretty rare variation of the close Sicilian, and he was able to set some unusual problems in the opening that his opponent didn't cope with very well. So let's get started. Knight c3, g3, bishop g2, d3. So both sides play the most common moves, and in this position another possibility is knight ge2, but white played bishop e3. But in any case, in the game black played a plan with e5, which makes it a bit difficult for white to come up with something concrete. So for example, I also looked at knight ge2, and one of the ideas is that against e5, white can play the interesting move h4 with the idea of h5. But anyways, one of the main lines, for example, if white had played knight ge2, is just playing knight f6, castle, bishop d7, or castling. And the idea of bishop g5, which looks a little bit weird, but one of the ideas is to play queen d2, and to make it a little bit awkward for black. So in any case, this is one interesting variation, and white follows up with queen d2. But anyway, I looked at this variation a long time ago because there was one grandmaster who played this quite often against me in blitz, but I concluded that the positions were fine for black after playing something like rook a c8, knight d4, and then b5. So for example, rook c8, knight d4, and he can continue with b5 and a5. So in any case, this variation isn't too important. Let's go to the game with bishop e3. The interesting thing after bishop e3 is that actually black has so many choices it's difficult to choose. So for example, black can choose to play e6 and knight e7. He can choose to play rook b8 and b5. He can choose to play e5. He can choose to play some sort of plan with h5. He can choose to play knight f6. And he can even choose to play the extremely rare f5, which I would imagine some people would think I'm a terrible chess player if I suggested the move f5, but you know what, I didn't really find anything wrong with it. So in any case, I'll just play out a few moves of some of the common variations. So for example, if knight f6, h3, knight d4, knight e2, and then e5 looks very solid for black. It's a very common variation. Rook b8 is actually the main line in correspondence. White usually follows up after bishop e3 with queen d2. So in this variation, there's queen d2, b5, knight e2, and one interesting move is playing h5 here. And this kind of emphasizes how dynamic the position is for black, because you can basically get away with almost any pawn move. So in any case, I looked at this variation a little bit more. h3, b4, and here I was basically planning to play e6 and knight e7 as one possibility. f4, e6. White would like to play knight takes d4 possibly, but so he plays bishop e3, and bishop f2, and in any case, black has pretty good counterplay on the queen side here. So but going back, the move f5 is pretty fascinating. I'm not quite sure what plan white is supposed to choose here, besides to try to make it look like black's pawn structure is a little bit exposed, or his king position is a little bit exposed. But I didn't quite see how to do that. For example, if I take on f5, e takes f5, bishop takes f5, queen d2, simply playing knight f6, h3 to prevent knight g4, and castling. And I was looking at the plan of playing knight d4 and then e5, and it seems like black has pretty interesting counterplay. So, and there's even the plan with queen a5, with the idea of knight d4, queen d2, queen a5. This is pretty interesting because in some variations black can play f5, in some variations black can play bishop g4. So let's say if knight e2, then bishop g4 is interesting. And one of the neat points about this variation is that when you play queen a5, knight d1 is no longer possible because of knight takes c2 check. So in this variation with bishop g4, let's say f4, yeah, bishop takes e2, and he can't play knight takes e2 because of knight takes c2 check, which would win the exchange. So anyway, I looked at this variation with knight takes e2, queen b6, but I think black is just fine in this variation. It's opposite color bishops, but his position is very solid, and I don't really see any problems after d takes c3, b takes c3, and then e5. So, but in this position, after queen a5, f4 is another move. And here I looked at knight h6 with the idea of knight g4, so h3 and then f5. And black is basically planning to just keep improving his pieces. Castling, bishop d7, knight f7, rook aca, e6. So I looked at, for example, knight f3, castle, and black has a pretty natural follow-up after that. Again, it's not really that obvious what white's supposed to be doing here because black has built up a very solid position. So as we can see from this, black has a very wide range of possibilities, and none of them actually look outright bad. So yeah, it seems like Carlsen just wanted to get an interesting position on the board and just play it. So e5 is the fourth most common move in this position. It's a little bit rare, but not a bad move. White has a couple possibilities. Queen d2 is the main move. f4 has also been played, and in the game he played knight h3. But I looked at f4, which is interesting because one of the ideas is to play f takes e5 when black should probably take back with a piece because otherwise the c5 pawn falls. So I looked at, for example, knight e7, f takes e5, knight takes e5, knight ge2, castle, castle, bishop e6. But in general, this position looks very solid for black because he can just follow up with queen d7 or knight g4. There are a wide variety of moves. So if queen d2, knight g4, I can play queen d7 and then bring my rook in, and it's a pretty good position. So yeah, for example, follow up with b5, b4, and black has no bad pieces and no particular problems. So f4 would have been interesting, probably not super strong, but so queen d2 was actually the main move, and black normally just plays knight e7 and then plays knight d4 and then castles. But yeah, this variation, one of white's ideas is to play knight h4 and sometimes try to sneak in f5. So I looked at bishop g4, which is still the main line in correspondence. Knight h4, e takes f4, bishop takes f4, and then queen d7. Basically, black's just playing solid moves here, planning f6, rook f7, rook a f8, and then probably b5, and he's built up a very solid position. For example, rook f2, f6, bishop e3, rook f7, and then rook a f8, and black is perfectly solid and has no problems. So considering that black is generally fine in the main line, knight h3 by Carlsen made a lot of sense. And black played knight e7 and intending castling, and then f4 was played. I was wondering about the very fascinating move h5 here, but I don't think it's really that good. So let's say if h5, queen d2, which gives the possibility of queenside castling, knight d4. In this case, queenside castling doesn't look good because of b5, and black is just too active. But after the move knight g5, it's not quite obvious what black should do here, because getting the knight out of f5 doesn't look easy. I mean, if you play f6, for example, then after knight f3 you can play knight h4. For example, if bishop g4, then there's knight h4 with the idea of f5 and then h3. So I looked a little bit at bishop e6, knight h4, and let's say some natural moves. Black tries to prepare queenside castling, queenside castling, king b1, king b8, and then knight d5. And there's a bit of trouble with the g6 pawn here, so I don't think black can say he's fully equal here. So h5 would be an interesting move if you could get in h4 effectively somehow, but I don't think there's any need for it. Probably in this position I would have just tried to play the normal plan with castle and rook b8, and I actually like the plans with b6 here. So for example, castle, rook b8, let's say white plays a3, b6, queen d2, and yeah, black can follow up with bishop b7, queen d7, and probably f5. So one line that I looked at was knight g5, bishop b7, takes, and then queen d7. And in this position, there are a couple possibilities. Black can play f6, he can play f5. I also like simply rerouting the knight by knight c8, bishop h6, and then f6. And black just follows up with knight d6 and has a very solid position. So, in general, black has a really solid position. The important thing is just that he has to find some sort of plan. And so in the game he played knight d4, which is interesting because now h5 does sort of become a threat. Not immediately, but I mean after castling, black castled as well. And here I was thinking about the move g4. But probably g4 was a bit risky. I don't think this was really what Carlsen wanted because it seems that he wanted to control the position well. So for example, even after f6, f5, b6, maybe black can get in bishop b7 and d5. It's not exactly clear what's going on here. But more importantly, there's the move f5. And then the knight on h3 looks a little bit strange, and black seems to be pretty well placed for this. So for example, g takes f5, g takes f5. Let's say f takes e5, d takes e5, e takes f5. After these captures, white tries to use the e4 square to try to prove some sort of advantage, but it seems that black's play is too easy here. He can just play queen d7, rook a d8, and maybe c4. So I looked at knight g5, queen d7, queen d2, and then rook a d8, and c4 is a possibility, bishop g4 is a possibility. Even though white has the e4 square, I don't think white has anything going here. So with that considered, it's pretty understandable why he didn't play g4. Let's say he plays king h1, try to move his king out of the way, bishop d7, and still it's not really clear what white's trying to do here. So takes, but black is doing perfectly well here. White's only real plan is to try to move the h3 knight somewhere, into e4 maybe, but even if, let's say, bishop d2, there's h6 followed by queen h4, and black has pretty active pieces. So it's quite understandable why Carlsen chose queen d2. So he chose queen d2, and already here I didn't really like how black handled the position. Black played bishop d7 followed by queen c8. He may have just missed Carlsen's move, I'm not sure. But in this position, I figured that there are a couple of very solid ways to play. First of all, there's bishop g4, simply followed by queen d7. And just like in some of the previous variations I've shown, let's say queen d7, rook a e8, and then b5, black simply follows up and plays solid and natural moves and has a good position. And also it's a little bit awkward, you know, what do you do with this h3 knight? If you play knight f2, then there's either knight f3 check or bishop f3. So another possibility is simply to play f6, which is a very solid move, and then it's not entirely clear what white's supposed to do with his f4 pawn, because pushing it isn't possible, and playing f takes e5 doesn't achieve anything. So I was looking at f6, knight f2, b6, very solid move, intending bishop b7 and possibly f5. So let's say rook a d1, bishop b7, let's say knight e2, possibly with c3, and now f5. And black has a very active position as well. So it seems that white doesn't really get an advantage in this variation pretty much in any line, but at least it's tricky, and so in this position I would have probably chosen f6 with the idea of b6 and bishop b7. It just seems the most fluid and consistent possibility. So bishop d7 was played, knight d1, which is a strong move by Carlsen, and he's able to play knight df2, and then his positions actually seems fairly harmonic. Even in this position after knight d1 with the intention of knight df2 or c3, I probably would have just chosen b6 again. It's the most solid move and it's positionally consistent with his previous play. So for example, if c3, knight c6, if knight g5, trying to bring the knight back in, then after rook c8, there's a possibility of simply playing e takes f4, bishop takes f4, f6, knight f3, and then d5. And it seems that black is able to get rid of white's mini pressure here. So let's say white plays knight f3, then after bishop e6, he is already preparing d5 in some cases, or maybe after f6. So it seems to me that b6 was a very positionally sound decision. Queen c8 looked a little bit questionable because it didn't actually achieve anything in the game. So white improved his knight on d1, and again, of course, I would have chosen b6, b6, c3, knight c6, knight g5. So for example, the move a5 looks a little bit strange, but at least it always prevents a3 and b4, and at the same time it's useful for black in case he wants to play a4, a3 at some stage, or even b5, b4 at some stage. So I looked at knight f3, bishop e6, and black can follow up with f6, rook d8, and then d5. And I really didn't see anything for white here, even after the strange plan by black of bishop d7 and queen c8. Still didn't really look like much for white. But anyway, he voluntarily went back, and perhaps here it would have been interesting to play f takes e5 because he's forced to recapture with a piece. So after knight takes e5, c3, white can play knight f4, b3, and then d4. After he's controlled the c4 square, he can play d4 and gain more time. So I think white probably would be slightly better here, just by advancing in the center. In any case, he played c3, and here black played b5, which I think was incorrect. I've played similar moves with black many times, because it's not quite obvious to human eyes why b5 is a weakness or why it's not particularly strong. But you'll see in the game that the problem is just that it doesn't achieve anything. He was never able to play b5 before. The c5 pawn was a little bit awkward, and eventually in the game the b5 pawn was just doing nothing there. So again, b6 was the right choice, and variations similar to a couple moves ago. Black can play, for example, queen c7 and rook a d8, knight f3, bishop e6, and again he can play f6, rook d8, and then d5. And once you get in d5 in a position like this, black has no problems at all. But after b5, it looks to me like white is clearly better. Simply after f takes e5, knight takes e5. You know, if it was black's move, he could play rook b8 and b5 and b4, or b4 immediately. And maybe, given that extra time, black wouldn't be so badly off. I mean, maybe it would be around equal. But after bishop h6, it looks to me like black just has a very awkward time. I think that for the sake of time, black should have played bishop takes h6, queen takes h6, and then f6. At least in this case, white would have had to waste a little bit of time. You know, maybe he would have moved his queen back at some stage, but still white's better after d4. So in any case, he played, yeah, queen a6 was another possibility, but it looks like white's just better after taking, and then knight f4. Another interesting possibility is playing knight d1 and knight e3, when it becomes awkward to figure out what to do for black with not only the d5 square, but also the e5 knight. So for example, rook c8, knight d1, and knight e3. We can double rooks on the f file with rook f2, rook a f1. There's also d4. So So we played knight 7 c6, which wasted quite a lot of time. Carlsen simply exchanged bishops, so the king side has no real defenders. Knight f4. Here there are two possibilities. You can play rook a d1, or you can play knight d1 and knight e3 like I mentioned. But in the game, black played queen d8. Unfortunately, there's nothing else really that's very good. So he just wanted to improve his a8 rook and play rook c8, although that didn't achieve anything. So white played rook a d1, rook c8, queen e2, and now he's preparing to play d4. h5, so now the knight can come to g4, d4, c takes d4, c takes d4. Now it's pretty clear, just looking at the pawn structure, when you see d4, e4 versus the d6 pawn here, which is also isolated, it's pretty obvious that white's positionally better. And black is not really able to do anything in this pawn structure. So knight g4 was the only move, and white simply played h3. And after knight takes f2, he took back with the queen. Could have been interesting to take with the rook, but taking with the queen was perfectly good. And now the important thing is that black has no good pawn moves, and his minor pieces aren't very good, and his rooks have nothing to do. So he's just ended up in a position with nothing obvious to really do. So knight e7 was played, which controls not only the king side, but also the d5 square. And white played rook d3, which is a nice move. He's preparing rook f3 in most cases, and he puts a lot of pressure on the f7 pawn. So b4 was played, and then rook f3. And the first threat is knight takes h5 check and rook takes f7 check. So in view of the threat of knight takes h5, black played queen e8. But, you know, even if he plays king g8, there's still g4. And then, let's say, takes. Here you can play rook g3 if you want to, but even the move rook b3 is very unpleasant for black. Simply, white's preparing to play queen h4, and so let's say d5, bishop h3, queen d7, and queen h4. And in this case, the position must be lost for black. His king position is just too weak here. So queen e8 was played, and g4 was a very strong move. And now we can see how how exposed black's king position is. And unfortunately, by taking twice on g4, after either rook g3 or maybe even rook b3 again, black simply has to defend against too many threats. So in the game, black didn't dare take the pawn, but white's threat here, okay, his first threat is to play queen h4 and queen g5, which would threaten knight h5 check. But he has plenty of other threats as well. So after bishop b5, he could have played knight d3, but rook e1 looks very good. And now one possibility is not only to play e5, e6, but also just as he played with the idea of g5. So in the game, queen d8 was played. Unfortunately, there's no real defense here. And now g5. And now the first threat is to play rook h3. And so for example, let's say knight c6, which was probably the best defense. Then we can play rook h3. And the point is that if you take the pawn on g5, then there's knight h5 check. And this is winning immediately. If you move the king, then there's knight f6 check and mate on h7. And if you take on h5, then there's rook g3, which is completely winning. So in this position, the black king is in a pretty tragic state. So if rook h8, I looked at simply take, and then e5, takes, and then the threat of e6 looks impossible to stop. Queen d8, and then e6, takes. And this position is lost for black. So in view of this, it doesn't look like there was any defense, but he played queen b6, which is kind of the same as resigning, because bishop h3 and bishop e6 was extremely powerful. So rook d8 was played, and then bishop e6. And the first threat is knight h5 check, followed by rook takes f7 check. But also if you play knight g8, for example, then there's bishop takes f7, followed by knight e6, or if king takes, then there's knight d5. So he could have resigned here, but he wanted to keep playing. So after bishop e8, maybe even a simpler or more fun win could have just been rook h3, and now there's no defense against knight h5 check. So for example, bishop d7, knight h5 takes, check, and then rook takes h5. And there's the only way to defend against mate on h8 is to play queen takes d4 check, but only computer's going to play that move. So instead of this, the very strong knight d5 was played, and of course black is completely paralyzed and completely losing. So knight takes d5, bishop takes d5, and in this position white's first threat is to play rook h3, and followed by queen f6, and there's absolutely no defense here, so black resigned. But a pretty smooth and easy win for Carlsen, but very instructive.